So if you could just start off by telling us just a little bit about you, that would be great, just to begin.
Sure, no problem. So I'm Shekar Krishnan, and I'm the council member elect for District 25, which is in Jackson Heights and Elmhurst, Queens. And I always said that I was running for city council because I understand how important it is for everyone to have a home. And I know that because prior to entering politics, I've been a civil rights lawyer for housing justice, representing low-income tenants in some of the poorest communities of New York City, fighting against evictions and displacement and gentrification. And I strongly believe in doing this work and also being a longtime community activist here in Jackson Heights and Elmhurst when it comes to our immigrant communities, our public schools, our park and open space. I strongly believe that I always say housing is the most urgent crisis because it connects to every other crisis around us. Like where you live affects everything around you. The resources and services that we need but don't get for Elmhurst Hospital right here in our community. We were the epicenter of this pandemic in the entire country. And that wasn't any accident. It was a result of decades of disinvestment in our neighborhoods. And that perspective of seeing how where your home is affects all of those things, our public hospital like Elmhurst, our public schools, the lack of park and open space that we have. All of these things really stand out to me, given my work as a civil rights lawyer for so long and my community activism here in Jackson Heights and Elmhurst. And that's what prompted me to run in the first place. And, you know, seeing that also through the lens, as we just talked about, of being a public school parent of a 6-year-old and a 3-year-old, and also the son of immigrants from India, and now proudly one of the first 2 South Asians ever elected to the city council in the history of New York City, and the first Indian American ever elected. And to have that happen here in Jackson Heights, which has such a special place at the heart of South Asian immigrant experience in this country, is something that's never lost on me.
So, just keying off of that, it is kind of stunning, I think, to me, that there haven't been a South Asian presence on the New York City Council. It's a huge body, so it's a lot of people, a lot of races over the years, and it's also happening at kind of a strange moment in American history, right? We've got a huge racial movement going on right now in so many ways, right? Starting with, if you think about last year and George Floyd, if you think about the conversation or dialogue or yelling that's happening related to CRT,
Yep.
for example,
Yep. Yeah.
Asian hate crimes that have been sort of in the spotlight over the course of the last year plus, and then yet there's not just your election. You mentioned your other fellow South Asian representation on the city council, Shahana Neef, and then also in other places in the country, there are South Asians that have and other people of color that have risen to the ranks, and not to leave out Eric Adams, of course, the new mayor or the incoming mayor of New York City. So how do you reconcile all of that, this bizarre racial moment in time, and what does that mean for you and how you navigate your new job?
Well, I just taking a step back for a second, I think one of the big things that shocked people when I would go knocking doors too was before people couldn't believe that. But I don't think that ever surprised Shahana or me for that matter, because we know the way in which our communities have been, our Asian American communities in particular, have been so invisibilized. The hate against our Asian American communities, we always say, is nothing new. And I just did a panel yesterday with 3 other great panelists, elected officials, and great leaders in our Asian American communities, in Congresswoman Grace Meng, Councilmember-elect Linda Lee, and Assemblymember Yulene New, with the Asian American Federation. And we talked about this, just how a lot of these prejudices and stigmas go back generations. And so the hate against us has gone back for a long time. But because of these stigmas, we've never been seen as a community. When it comes to language access, so many resources and services from our government are not in the languages of our Asian American communities. Our food delivery systems during the pandemic were really a failure when it came to providing halal food, for example, or working with Asian American communities on the ground to make sure the food was totally appropriate. And to every other issue we can think of, the way in which the pandemic has affected our South Asian communities, we've never had any disaggregation of data when it comes to our Asian American communities. And so you see all the ways in which our voices have never been truly heard or seen. And it's because of that we haven't had representation, or the other way around, because we've lacked representation, our issues haven't been heard. But I think one of the most powerful examples of the rising power of our Asian American communities, and in particular our working class Asian immigrant communities, has been the taxi worker fight right here in New York City. This is a fight that goes back decades, where the city, it was the result of the city's predatory lending practices that so many drivers who are overwhelmingly South Asian were mired in debt, facing foreclosures or bankruptcies. And I have and so does Shahana too. Shahana and I both have two communities with some of the largest driver resident populations in all of New York City. So both Shahana and I became much closer and really got to spend so much time together during this fight. But also we met so many drivers who, for example, I would see during the daytime protesting at City Hall, and then I'd see in the evenings at Durga Puja or at Jummah Friday prayers. And this was such a powerful working class movement that I think, one, shows the might of our South Asian community coming together, saying that our voices and the voices of our workers will be heard. And I think, two, in doing that, provides a model for so many labor and other organizing movements of how it can be done. So I always use that as the example. And really, we celebrated. We made our history on election night. The next day, the mayor announced the victory. So I was down at City Hall the next day celebrating with the drivers, and they were so happy. They wanted to celebrate our election. They came and hugging me. We danced bhangra and everything. And they're like, we're so happy you won. I said, no, I don't care about winning. It's not about my victory. This is about yours. We're so happy to be here.
How do you go though from grassroots activism and community action, the way that you have and the way that Shahana have worked on a broad array of issues, and now you're part of the machine. Now you're part of the government, or you will soon be. There's a lot of diverse voices on that. It's 51 member city council, which is huge, and ultimately the mayor has the power of the pen to decide whether he agrees with with what you all put forward or not. How do you make that shift? It's a pretty significant difference. Or maybe it's not. What do you think?
No, it is a massive shift. I would not be being honest if I didn't say I feel, nervous, wary, and also excited, but especially nervous and wary about it. Because, you're absolutely right. For my entire career, I've been on the outside of City Hall, holding our government officials accountable when they violate the housing laws or fair housing laws, and combining our work in the housing movement with fighting in the courts or in the halls of government. And we always say the courts are part of the problem. Government is part of the problem. That perspective doesn't change coming into this position. In fact, I hold those principles even closer. I've always said during the campaign, I don't think politics is the movement, nor does it lead the movement. It has a role to play, but a limited and defined role. And I think it's that perspective that I take with me into this work too, knowing the limits, knowing the realities of politics, and understanding that coming into it too. And I feel like you have to really hold that close and know that the real work is happening on the outside through the grassroots organizing. And that is really where the movement is, and really seeing politics as following the leadership of the movement, of the grassroots organizers on the ground, and those most impacted who are doing the work. I think you have to see it that way. One of the things that gives me, a hope or confidence in seeing it that way too, is as a lawyer for housing justice, I would always say, no matter what the laws say on paper, it doesn't matter if they're not being enforced in reality to actually protect tenants on the ground every day, for example. So we may have some of the strongest rent laws on the books, some of the strongest protections when landlords violate heat and hot water laws, but I've seen firsthand sitting in the kitchens of tenants where their ceilings are crumbling, or meeting with them in building lobbies that are full of lead paint or that are full of mold, or literally seeing landlords take sledgehammers to their buildings and destroy them overnight, all wildly illegal, violation of every law. And I've seen the way in which government has utterly failed to respond in those situations, and how we've had to really mobilize outside of court, on the streets, to make sure that our tenants were able to return back home, or that their rights were protected. And so I come in with no illusions that the work isn't really the laws being passed at City Hall. Sure, that's important and that's all good. And we could use better laws too, but that's not going to mean a thing unless those laws are being actually applied to protect and uplift low-income communities of color, given the amount of systemic inequality in this city. And that's what I'm much more concerned about than what happens in City Hall. And I think that perspective you always have to have going into this work.
How will you approach your job from day one, or your new role, I should say, since presumably you'll still have another job?
Sure. In specific terms, there are three things that come to mind for my district in Jackson-Elmhurst that are important to me and are my priorities. First, I've seen the way in which in this pandemic, the serious inequities of healthcare and healthcare access in our city. I think our public hospitals, like Elmhurst Hospital, are the heart of healthcare in New York City. They don't turn away a single patient. They see everyone. They're in immigrant communities like mine. Yet Elmhurst Hospital has less than one bed for every 1,000 patients that comes through its doors. And I also, and knowing this, but what I really learned during the campaign was the complete inequality in public dollars that went from to private hospitals over public hospitals like Elmhurst. I mean, that was really shocking to me to see that Elmhurst Hospital and other public safety hospitals were getting less in public funding than private healthcare institutions. So one of the things that I want to do is to really make sure that we are reinvesting and far more in Elmhurst Hospital and in our public hospitals, whether it's providing more bed space, whether it's providing more language accessible services for our immigrant communities who use Elmhurst Hospital, whether it's making sure that our maternal health clinics or our new doula program in Elmhurst Hospital gets far more in resources and funding. I'm very concerned with making sure we're investing far more dollars in Elmhurst Hospital and correcting that inequity. The second thing I'd say is, this pandemic really exposed how also Jackson Heights and Elmhurst, we are two communities with some of the least amount of open space or green space in all of New York City. And we've really needed for so long a community center in our neighborhood, a place where our youth can come together, where our seniors can, organizations can do workshops. We've never had it. And coming out of this pandemic, I think that is not just something we want, that is a right that we deserve. So I'm really concerned with making sure that we're bringing a community center to our neighborhood too. And finally, I would say, as a community of immigrants, as a public school parent myself too, I think it is crucial that our public schools, our local public schools, are being as embracing and as inclusive as possible of our incredibly diverse immigrant families and communities in these neighborhoods. And so I want to make sure that we are bringing bilingual education to every one of the local public schools in my district. I think, and particularly bilingual education that centers multilingual learners or immigrant students or children from immigrant families. I do think our education system needs to really see and embrace the different cultures and immigrant families of our schools, and making sure that we are, as local public schools, uplifting bilingualism and biliteracy too. So those are three priorities of mine that I'm very concerned with.
And how do you get them done fast? People talk about government being slow. The taxi win, for example, was a long time coming, right? It was many years in the making. So how do you knock off some of these things on your to-do list quickly? Is that possible?
Yeah, well, by putting all the pressure that we can on government to deliver for our communities, right? Part of it is the framing of making sure that it's very clear in City Hall and city government that our city needs to prioritize neighborhoods like mine. When we come out and we talk about this pandemic, as I said before, now what's clear to everyone is how much neighborhoods like mine in Jackson and Elmhurst are the neighborhoods that sustain this city, that we are a community of essential workers, right? And I think it's critical that government, whether it's City Hall or the City Council, recognize that if we truly want to rebuild this city, we need to start with communities like mine when it comes to those services. And two, it's fighting like hell to make sure my community gets those resources too. I'm proud that already, for example, for a community center, with the current and outgoing council member Danny Drum, who's done so much for our neighborhoods too, he's already been able to get in place, and working with him, we've secured 2.75 million put aside in this year's budget towards a community center in our neighborhoods. So that's just the first step. There's much more to go, but I do think that's an example of the way we intend to do this work. The taxi workers fight is another example too, where Shahan and I both joined that fight from the very, very beginning. Even before we've been elected, even before the general election, we were part of this fight with our colleagues too, every step of the way. The point that we've developed such close friendships with the drivers, and we've already said once we get in January, we're going to do a big celebration at City Hall. But that should give an indication of our both passion and our commitment to these fights that are independent of being elected or not. And so we're doing this already before we're in, and that should give a sense of how much we intend to do once we're in too.
And just the last couple of questions. One is, because it's a short term, you'll be running, it's a 2-year term, and then you'll be running again in 20. Well, let me start by saying, is it too soon to talk about the next term? Will you already have to be running for reelection from day one, where you might not have otherwise had to be if it was a 4-year term? Is that going to be on your mind, or are you thinking about that as you navigate the new role?
I don't think about that. It is a shorter term, that's true. But I do believe, and I think we saw this during the campaign too, that if you do the work and you do it well and stay focused on that, the results will also take care of themselves. So people will see what the work that you're bringing is and how we go about it, right? Our campaign, we built such a broad coalition of multi-generational, multicultural support. And that in the end resulted in a resounding victory that really showed how broad our community support was. And I do think that that same kind of work ethic, that same kind of commitment to our neighborhoods is what I'm focused on, to make sure we get the most resources and services for our communities, and that we're addressing these citywide systemic inequalities. And I think I want to focus on that. The politics is secondary, but I do believe that people will see, the work will speak for itself too.
Great. And so my last question is, what have I not asked you? What have you not had a chance to talk about? I know you've done a ton of press, and you obviously have your campaign work that was been going on for the last year or so, but tell me what you haven't had a chance to say.
Sure. One thing that I thought was worth mentioning, especially for the Juggernaut too, was, I do think it is so crucial for us as South Asian communities to be seeing our work, seeing our identity as part of a larger struggle across immigrant communities and communities of color. And that in the way that we advocate for our communities, we must join up in the fight for Black and Brown communities, and learn from them, and also support them in their fights, and build those cross-cultural, cross-racial relationships, and be a part of those struggles too. And if we have such a large South Asian community here, we also have a very large Latino community too. This was really the heart of the immigrant experience for so many Latin American communities in our city too. And I learned Spanish really through my work as a civil rights lawyer for housing justice, where so many of my clients were Spanish speaking, and in the meetings we'd have in their lobbies or in their apartments, or the work that we do in coalition, I'd always do my best to really force an environment where I could just speak in Spanish and learn as much as I could through both my siblings in the Latino organizing spaces, and also through my clients as well. Can't stress the importance of that, and of learning languages beyond your own too, to expand the solidarity across cultures. One of the things I joked about that Arun Venugopal just wrote about in one of his articles was, when I would knock doors, especially with Spanish-speaking voters too, I knew my name would be very difficult for them to remember, right? So I'd spell it out for them on the phone. I had done about 1,200 calls just in Spanish to Spanish-speaking voters. I'd make sure to spell out my name to them too. And I would notice when they came to the polls that had my name written down on a piece of paper to make sure they got it. But I would have a tagline I'd always say at the doors where I'd say, no te olvide el hindú que habla español, which means don't forget the Indian who speaks Spanish, which I knew would stay. And then when they'd actually come to vote, this would be over months, when they'd come to vote, some of the Spanish-speaking voters at the polls, they would see me and they'd say, el hindú que habla español. And it was so touching. They remembered it and they would say, I'm so touched that you speak my language and the perspective it gives you on our culture and our community. And this is why I believe in you and want to vote for you.
New York City Council Member-elect District 25, Shekar Krishnan, thank you so much for talking with the Juggernaut. It was wonderful.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me.
To meet you. Take care.